Welcome back to Wages and Employment at Wilfrid Laurier University. Today we're going to look at what happens when we introduce a simplified welfare program to our basic labor supply model. For reference, you should pair this video with readings in Chapter 3 of your textbook. In Canada, our welfare programs are often referred to as social assistance or income assistance programs, depending on where you live. The reason for that is that each province is responsible for administering its own programs. Some of the funding is from the federal government, but really the federal government offers a large transfer to the provinces who then decide how to allocate that money to all education and social programs. While each province has its own program, they have some things in common. Generally, the benefits available depend on things like family size and type, so if you're a single parent or a couple, for example, and the benefits depend on whether the province thinks you are employable. In Ontario, for example, we have two programs. Ontario Works for those considered generally employable, and Ontario Disability Support Program for everyone who is unable to work due to a disability. In all provinces, there are limits to the income you can receive from other sources before being ineligible for benefits. And there are often restrictions on assets, including how much money you can hold in a savings account. For example, in Ontario, a single parent is allowed up to $10,500 in assets, with exemptions for some property and vehicles. To give you a sense of what the benefits are across Canada, this table represents the support that an eligible single parent could receive from social assistance programs, plus any child benefits available from provincial and federal governments. In Ontario, this single parent could receive just over $21,000 in 2018. That gets them to about 72% of the official poverty line in Canada. I'll note that a single parent without any kids in Ontario would receive a total of $9,646 in 2018, or about $800 per month. I think it's worth keeping that in mind when we start talking about incentives. Your baseline consumption would be about $800 per month if you don't do any paid work in the labor market. So we'll start with a simplified welfare program to take into our basic model of labor supply. Here, a person is going to be eligible for a benefit equal to B dollars if they don't participate in the labor market. This, for instance, could be the $800 per month that a single person in Ontario is eligible for. In this example, we're also going to have a 100% clawback applied to any earnings. What this means is that for every $1 earned in the labor market, their benefits are reduced by $1. So, for example, if you worked for 1 hour and received $15 in wages, your social assistance benefit would be reduced to $785, and your total income is still $800. I realize this seems rather odd to some, but for many years, this was how many social assistance programs in Canada were structured. We'll return to our basic model here, but notice we are starting in a world with no non-labor income. That makes most sense when we're talking about social assistance recipients. Their full potential income is W1T if they worked all the time. But this person is choosing the bundle at point A, where they can work H1 hours with L1 hours of leisure. Now suppose they are offered the benefit B if they do not work at all. This creates this segment here in purple, in line with benefits B. Suppose the person worked a bit and earned some income. Well, that would reduce their benefits dollar for dollar, and they'd still be at this benefit B in terms of their total income. And they would continue like that until they worked enough to reach their original potential income constraint. They run out of benefits entirely when their earnings, WH, are equal to the maximum benefit B. We commonly think of this as a welfare wall. How many hours would you have to work Before going any further, I like to highlight the point that our textbook examples tend to exaggerate the size of potential benefits to make our diagrams easier. Here, I mapped out a slightly more realistic example, where the person can earn $15 per hour. That is a bit higher than the minimum wage in Ontario in September 2020. And they could receive $30 per day from social assistance. That roughly aligns with Ontario rates for the single person mentioned earlier. I've assumed here that the person has 16 hours every day to make leisure work decisions, allowing for some normal sleep patterns to survive. Here, that welfare wall that we're concerned with doesn't seem that huge to me. To then think about preferences over leisure and consumption, I think you'd have to draw in some unique preferences to say this is a huge factor to convince someone to leave their full-time job and move to the welfare program. With that said, let's return to our standard diagram here and think through a few key points. First, in our world without any welfare, we thought about a person's reservation wage as the slope of their indifference curve, or the marginal rate of substitution, at that point where their leisure time was equal to their time endowment. That was represented as this orange dashed line here, and told us that wage that would make the person just indifferent between not working and working at all. Just a few seconds here. Now, when we turn to our world with a welfare program, we need to find that wage that would make them just indifferent between not working at all, which is point D here, and working for even a second. You have to imagine raising wages from W1 until the reservation wage line reaches the same indifference curve that point D lies on. You can see that the reservation wage here, WR2, is much higher than it was before. So at this point, we are well equipped to think about how we can alter welfare programs to bring more people into the labor force. One simple option is to reduce the benefits available. If low enough, people will leave welfare and participate in labor force. However, it may also leave a group of people who really needed assistance with inadequate support to cover some basic bills. This type of approach in the past has reduced the number of recipients, but also seemed to raise homelessness as well. Another option is to increase the price of leisure, making work more attractive. This can be done with subsidies or increasing the minimum wage, but could also come about by ensuring welfare recipients have access to education and training that can improve their wage offers. The downside is that government programs will cost policy dollars, so the benefits have to be weighed against those costs. Another option is to change the clawback rate, or the implicit tax rate, as it is sometimes called. Rather than creating a welfare wall, whereby a person loses $1 of benefits when they earn $1, you can reduce that clawback rate to something less than 100%. This can make additional work much more attractive, raising the price of leisure for that part of the potential income constraint when compared to standard welfare walls. We'll discuss this more in the next section, but this has been a successful approach taken by many welfare programs. The last option we consider here involves changing preferences. This falls outside the normal scope of research for economists, but we know that social stigma can discourage some activities. And I think it's fair to say there's generally been a stigma attached to the use of welfare. But I'd be concerned that worsening that stigma could lead to some people being pushed even further from the paid labor market with long-term damage. Efforts to make people feel more included in society as potential labor market participants may go much further in terms of bringing people into the labor market. So then when we turn to the question of whether the structure of welfare programs has a significant effect on labor supply, but pulling out this type of data or pulling this out of the data, I should say, is challenging. We might see some policy challenges, but at the same time, there are changes in what jobs are available and what wage rates are being offered. Separating all of this can be quite tricky. To think about this, I've mapped out the benefits available to single individuals in Ontario in 2018 dollars as vertical bars, as well as the portion of the population that received benefits as the solid line. The two series seem to line up. When benefits were more generous, there were more people taking them up. This might have suggested that benefit generosity leads to higher participation in the program, but that isn't necessarily the case. Consider that from our basic model of labor supply, an important part of the incentives is the wage offer in the labor market. When labor market conditions don't favor workers, such as when there's high unemployment, we might expect to see lower wage offers being made. Similarly, when unemployment drops, like it did for the second half of the 1990s, wages would rise, bringing more people into the labor market. Here, at least some part of the change in welfare beneficiaries over time could be attributed to changing labor market conditions. Overall, it's important to recognize there are many factors at play when thinking about these decisions. And while our basic model of labor supply can be used to inform policy design, we need to be mindful that these policies do not work in a vacuum. Real life is always much more complicated. In our next video, we're going to take a closer look at the negative income tax, which is often known as a guaranteed income, and forms the foundation for much of the basic income debates. We'll see you then.